Crimea, a region at the heart of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is making headlines again after a shocking new attack by Russian forces. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video so you can be notified instantly. Your support is important to me. What led to this bold move? How will Ukraine and the world react? This surprise attack in Crimea has sent shockwaves across the globe, raising questions about Russia's objectives in this high-stakes maneuver and whether it could mark a turning point in the ongoing conflict. We'll delve into the untold story behind this escalating crisis and its implications for global security. Discover the strategic importance of Crimea and why Russia is willing to take such bold actions. Learn about the impact of this attack on Ukraine's defenses, their counter-strategies, and the potential responses from NATO and other global powers. Stay tuned for an in-depth analysis of this critical moment in history, including expert insights and predictions about the future of Crimea and the broader implications for Europe and beyond. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more breaking news and expert commentary. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video so you can be notified instantly. Your support is important to me. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict began much earlier than many realize. Nearly 10 years ago, in 2014, Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea, effectively stealing the peninsula from Ukraine without firing a single shot. Armed soldiers without insignias began occupying Crimea, and despite evidence of Russian involvement, Putin denied any connection. Just 2 months later, he declared Crimea a part of Russia, marking the start of the current conflict. But how did this happen so easily? To understand, we must delve into Crimea's history and its strategic importance. Like much of Europe, Ukraine has a complex history of shifting borders, sovereignty, and a contentious relationship with Russia. The Crimean Peninsula has been settled and conquered by various groups throughout history. Early inhabitants included the Cimmerians, Scythians, Greeks, and Romans. By the 10th century, Prince Vladimir I of Kievan Rus established Slavic influence over the region. However, the Mongol Golden Horde later took control, establishing outposts and dominating Black Sea trade. By the 14th century, Islam had a strong influence on the region's Tatar population, and the Crimean Khanate emerged. In 1475, the Crimean Khanate came under Ottoman rule, remaining part of the empire for centuries. This changed in the late 18th century when the Russian Empire, under Catherine the Great, annexed Crimea in 1783 after a series of conflicts with the Ottomans. Russian expansion into Crimea heightened tensions with the Tatars, who were displaced multiple times throughout history, particularly during the Soviet era under Stalin. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Crimean Tatars briefly declared independence as the Crimean People's Republic. However, after the Russian Civil War, Crimea was incorporated into the Soviet Union as an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921. Under Stalin, many Crimean Tatars were forcibly deported to Siberia and Central Asia in 1944, accused of collaborating with Nazi forces during World War II. After the war, Crimea became a region of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic but was transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. This transfer, largely symbolic at the time, laid the groundwork for future disputes. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Crimea became part of independent Ukraine, though it retained autonomy as the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. However, its majority ethnic Russian population and Russia's strategic interests in the Black Sea Fleet complicated relations between Crimea and Kyiv. Despite agreements such as the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for assurances of territorial integrity, tensions persisted. Russia continued to maintain a presence in Crimea under a lease agreement for its Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Diplomatic incidents, such as the 2003 Kerch Strait Dam dispute and allegations of Russian interference in Crimean politics, further strained relations. By the early 2010s, Crimea had become a focal point for Russian ambitions. Events like the 2004 Orange Revolution and pro-Russian demonstrations in Crimea highlighted deep divisions within Ukraine. Pro-Russian politicians in Crimea and Russia's issuance of passports to Crimean residents suggested long-term plans for annexation. These efforts culminated in 2014, when Russia seized Crimea under the pretext of protecting ethnic Russians, using tactics seen in regions like South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The annexation of Crimea not only violated international agreements but also set the stage for the broader conflict that continues today. Russia's actions in Crimea underscore its strategic importance and its role as a flashpoint in the struggle between Ukrainian sovereignty and Russian expansionism. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which escalated dramatically in 2014, has deeper roots than many realize. The crisis intensified when Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine's pro-Russian president elected in 2010, deepened ties with Moscow. He extended Russia's lease to use Sevastopol for its Black Sea Fleet until 2042 and allowed the deployment of 25,000 Russian troops and air bases in Crimea. However, by 2012, Ukraine was negotiating closer integration with the European Union. This shift alarmed Moscow, and under pressure from Putin, Yanukovych abandoned the EU deal in 2013, opting for stronger ties with Russia. This decision triggered massive protests known as the Euromaidan Maidan, fueled by anger over corruption and Yanukovych's pivot towards Russia. Protests spiraled into nationwide unrest, culminating in February 2014 with Yanukovych fleeing to Russia after being ousted by Ukraine's parliament. Moscow viewed this as a coup and saw the new interim government as a threat to its influence in Ukraine. Shortly after, Putin convened a meeting with his security ministers, signaling plans to return Crimea to Russia. By late February, pro-Russian demonstrations surged in Crimea, supported by local activists and groups like the Night Wolves Motorcycle Club. Protesters, carrying Russian flags and wearing military emblems, began demanding a referendum on Crimea's status. This unrest escalated on February 27, 2014, when armed soldiers without insignias, later identified as Russian troops, seized key sites across Crimea, including the parliament and airports in Simferopol and Sevastopol. These little green men facilitated the appointment of Sergei Aksyonov, a pro-Russian politician, as Crimea's prime minister, despite his party receiving only 4% of the vote in the last elections. Under intimidation and isolation, the Crimean parliament voted to hold a referendum for greater autonomy from Ukraine, later expedited to March 16. Russian forces secured Crimea, cutting off communication and transportation links with mainland Ukraine, while replacing Ukrainian broadcasts with Kremlin-controlled media. On March 1, Aksyonov formally requested Russian intervention, claiming it was necessary to restore peace and stability. Putin quickly secured authorization from Russia's Federation Council to deploy troops in Ukraine. By March 2, Crimea was effectively under Russian control. Russian troops and local militias blocked Ukrainian forces, controlled critical infrastructure, and dominated communication channels. The referendum, held under duress, resulted in a claim that an overwhelming majority of Crimeans favored joining Russia. On March 18, Russia officially annexed Crimea, citing the referendum as justification. This annexation, widely condemned as illegal, violated the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and Ukraine's sovereignty. It also set a precedent for Moscow's later actions, including the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The Crimean crisis highlights the interplay of historical grievances, geopolitical strategy, and Russia's willingness to challenge international norms to assert its influence over former Soviet territories. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 marked a significant turning point in the geopolitical landscape, rooted in escalating tensions and strategic maneuvers. Following the initial deployment of Little Green Men, unmarked soldiers, in late February, additional Russian ground and air forces arrived in Crimea by March 4. This clear violation of the 1997 treaty between Russia and Ukraine, which allowed only the Black Sea Fleet to operate in Sevastopol, was accompanied by denials from Putin. Publicly, he dismissed claims of annexation and described the masked soldiers as ordinary citizens exercising their rights. However, Putin later admitted to orchestrating the operation and planning Crimea's incorporation into Russia as early as February. Internationally, Russia's actions violated the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia had pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Moscow, however, dismissed these accusations, citing vague geopolitical and socio-economic justifications. Putin claimed that Russian military presence in Crimea was necessary to protect its citizens and ensure the Crimean people's will was upheld, a narrative echoed during the later full-scale invasion of Ukraine. To legitimize the annexation, Russia's parliament amended its laws to facilitate the incorporation of foreign territories under the pretext of ineffective governance by their sovereign states. On March 11, Crimea's pro-Russian government, led by Sergei Aksyonov, declared independence from Ukraine, citing Kosovo's 2008 independence as a precedent. A referendum, originally scheduled for May, was hastily moved to March 16, with results claiming 97% support for joining Russia. However, evidence later revealed inflated numbers, though a majority of Crimea's Russian-speaking population did favor annexation. The referendum, held under military occupation and lacking credible oversight, was rejected by Ukraine, the EU, and the United States. Reports indicated irregularities, such as allowing non-residents with Russian passports to vote. International observers were limited to far-right European entities sympathetic to Putin, further undermining the referendum's legitimacy. Nevertheless, Russia swiftly moved forward, declaring Crimea an independent republic on March 17 and formally annexing it on March 18 through a treaty signed by Putin. In the weeks following, Russian forces seized remaining Ukrainian military bases, effectively consolidating control over the peninsula. By March 24, Ukraine ordered a full withdrawal of its forces from Crimea. International reactions included condemnation and non-binding UN resolutions denouncing the annexation. However, Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council and strategic alliances rendered these actions largely symbolic. Economic sanctions from Western nations, including the EU and the United States, targeted Russian officials and industries but failed to reverse the annexation. Russia was expelled from the G8, reverting it to the G7, and its voting rights in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe were suspended. Despite these measures, Putin's domestic approval surged, fueled by a wave of nationalist sentiment. Several nations, including Syria, Venezuela, North Korea, and Sudan, supported Russia's actions, while others, like China and India, maintained neutral stances. China's call for respecting Ukraine's sovereignty without directly condemning Russia underscored its balancing act between economic ties and geopolitical alliances. Post-annexation, Crimea was swiftly integrated into Russia, adopting Russian military jurisdiction, currency, and communication systems. Putin also promised the reintegration of Crimean Tatars exiled during Stalin's regime, though these efforts were criticized as token gestures amidst broader repression. While sanctions damaged Russia's economy, its strategic alliances and European reliance on Russian energy, particularly in Germany, weakened the West's collective response. This reliance allowed Russia to navigate the economic fallout while leveraging support from non-Western allies. The annexation of Crimea remains a defining moment in modern geopolitics, highlighting the challenges of enforcing international law against a determined and resourceful state actor. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 was driven by a combination of strategic, economic, and political motives, and its consequences continue to shape the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Strategically, Crimea provided Russia with key military assets, including the Sevastopol naval base, even after Ukraine gained independence in 1991. The peninsula also served as a critical foothold for Russian operations, such as supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime during the Syrian civil war in 2015, and more recently, as a base for launching attacks on Ukraine during the current war. The location of Crimea allows Russia to project power in the Black Sea region and beyond, offering access to southern trade routes and key maritime regions like the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Additionally, Crimea's offshore oil and gas reserves make it an economically valuable territory. Politically, the annexation of Crimea allowed Putin to weaken Ukraine's prospects of aligning more closely with the European Union and NATO, which he perceived as a threat to Russian influence in the region. Russia has long viewed Ukraine and Belarus as buffer states essential for its security, and losing Ukraine to Western alliances risked compromising this buffer. To justify the annexation, Putin invoked the protection of Crimea's ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking population, framing it as a reunification with the motherland. The largely bloodless annexation of Crimea also emboldened pro-Russian separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region. These separatists, with Russian support, declared independence in Donetsk and Luhansk, further destabilizing Ukraine. This set the stage for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Between 2014 and 2022, low-intensity conflict persisted in eastern Ukraine, but international attention waned until the invasion reignited global focus on the region. The weak international response to the Crimean annexation allowed Russia to consolidate its control over the peninsula and prepare for broader military operations. Despite sanctions and strained relations with the West, Russia continued to operate relatively freely, even hosting global events like the FIFA World Cup in 2018. This leniency signaled to Putin that he could act with impunity, further testing NATO and Western resolve in subsequent years. The current phase of the war has pushed Crimea back into the spotlight. The peninsula remains a critical point of contention, with Russia making its recognition as Russian territory a precondition for ending hostilities. Conversely, Ukraine, under President Volodymyr Zelensky, has made reclaiming Crimea a core objective, signaling that it will not accept any peace agreement that leaves the peninsula under Russian control. As Zelensky has stated, this began with Crimea, and it's likely to end with Crimea. The unresolved status of Crimea complicates any potential peace negotiations. Russia's insistence on holding the peninsula and Ukraine's determination to reclaim it create a significant impasse. The longer the war continues, the harder it becomes for either side to compromise, making lasting peace increasingly elusive. This conflict over Crimea is not only a regional issue but a broader warning for global stability. Russia's actions have revived the notion of territorial expansion through force, a practice thought to belong to history. The lack of severe consequences for such behavior risks encouraging other authoritarian leaders, such as China's Xi Jinping, in their ambitions, particularly regarding Taiwan. The international community faces a critical challenge in addressing these aggressions to ensure global peace and deter future violations of sovereignty.